Hey guys, the last Marvel Studios movie of the year, Ant-Man and the Wasp, just hit theaters on Thursday night. So it's time to give you guys my thoughts, as I do with all comic book based movies. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, no worries, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. However, I will get into all the spoilerific thoughts on this Monday's Variant Live. Anyway, I saw Ant-Man and the Wasp on Thursday night, and overall, I liked the movie, but I do think it had several problems. So let's start with the negative. My one major gripe is that the villain Ghost isn't really much of a villain at all. But the reason this bothered me so much is because the villain Ghost from the comics, although not widely known, has an extremely cool origin, backstory, and motivation. Not to mention, Ghost is an extremely creepy character in the comics, which I felt was something this movie could have used. But ultimately, they chose not to, and that was a letdown for me. For more detail on what I'm talking about, check out our Origin of Ghost episode, and know that the MCU Ghost is nothing like that. I'll also add that the fact they made Ghost a female didn't make a difference one way or the other for me. It was just the fact that the character as a whole had none of the same motives or agendas that the comic version has. It was like they basically came up with a completely new character and just used the name Ghost and some of the character's power set. Now that's all I could say without getting into spoiler territory, but I do think you will enjoy the movie more knowing that in advance. So I'll just say she's a villain who really isn't a villain, then we'll talk more about that on Monday. My next complaint is that the movie had no real driving motive. I mean, it did in a sense, but the main plot points all felt like they should have been a side story and not the main plot for the movie, leaving it with a pretty shallow overall story. That being the case, Ant-Man and the Wasp didn't really progress anything or push anything forward in the MCU. As an example for what I mean, Black Panther introduced us to Wakanda and we saw how he was dealing with becoming the king. Spider-Man Homecoming showed us how Peter Parker was dealing with his life after the events of Civil War and how he was asked to join the Avengers. He was also introduced to the Vulture, who was stealing and selling alien tech from the attack in New York on the black market, and the list goes on. Well, Ant-Man and the Wasp really had nothing like that to speak of. While that may sound kind of nitpicky, because not every Marvel movie has to push the bigger MCU picture forward, it still left the movie feeling like a departure from the MCU. And the more I think about it, the more I feel that the incredibly weak villain has to do with that. I mean, if the movie was more centered around Ghost as a stronger opponent for the heroes, with more time and depth taken on her motivations, that would have fixed a lot of the problems for me. And I think this is something that stood out even more because as an audience, we just saw Thanos tear through the MCU as an amazing and well-rounded villain in Infinity War. So the contrast between the two is glaring. Again, that's just my 2 cents. A lot of you may completely disagree with me, and that's 100% fine. But let's move on to what I did like, because again, I did like the movie overall. Like the first Ant-Man movie, this movie is really funny, which is probably one of its best qualities. For instance, there's an ongoing joke about close-up magic that is pretty hilarious, and there's several things like that. The gag we see in the trailers of Scott Lang shrinking to the size of a toddler is brilliant. In fact, I'd say the use of the Pym particles in general and the way they use the shrinking and growing is awesome throughout. So now that Ant-Man is established as a character, seeing how they just run with that and do all kinds of cool and funny stuff is a lot of fun. As for the cast, Paul Rudd is once again brilliant as Ant-Man, but Evangeline Lilly was also great as the Wasp. She just looks incredibly awesome, and I love the way they choreographed her fight scenes. There's one fight scene in particular where Wasp and Ant-Man tag team that is easily one of the coolest scenes in the entire movie. Then there's the character Lewis, again played by Michael Pena, and he has another amazing rant like we saw in the first movie. But his proteges, Dave, played by T.I., and Kurt, played by David Dastmalchian, are downright hysterical as well. Michael Douglas is great as Hank Pym, which is not shocking because he's Michael Douglas, and Michelle Pfeiffer was equally good as Janet Van Dyne. Again, not surprising because she's Michelle Pfeiffer, and I love her with my whole heart. So overall, the movie has a lot to like, especially if you like the first movie or just like Ant-Man in general. But I will say again, it still has its share of problems, with the main one being the villain for me. And I guess that shouldn't be too surprising, as one of the biggest complaints for the MCU as a whole has been its villains, with Thanos being the major exception, as he is easily one of the greatest villains I've seen on the big screen like ever. If I'm gonna rate this movie on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it a 6.5. As in my opinion, it's not as good as the first one, but still fun. Also, I know a bunch of you are probably wondering about the end credit scene. Well, there's a mid-credit scene, which is awesome. Definitely stay for that one. But the end credit scene, you're not missing much if you don't stay. But that's gonna bring another episode of Variant to a close. And remember, you can follow us on social media like our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and our website. Links for all of those are in the description as always. And if you like the channel, be sure to subscribe and then hit the bell next to it so you're notified whenever we upload a new video. Other than that, I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.